Hi, everyone. Just a few words about the final paper prompt so that you have a good idea what you're getting yourself into as you approach this course. So, as I mentioned in the syllabus video, there is a final paper due in this class, and it's what I would consider to be a standard exegesis paper, but maybe my ideas of exegesis papers are different from yours. So, in this prompt, I try to clarify some of those things, but basically, and please do read all this information, but I'll scroll down to the part that's in bold because that's the most important part. Your paper is divided into two sections. And so the first section is sort of the biblical studies, research, exegesis section. And it, generally speaking, answers the question, what did the text mean when it was heard/read within Israelite society? So looking at the text from a historical perspective, what did it mean at that time? And of course, you may have all kinds of different ideas about what uh, different ways to answer that question. And second, question two is, what does the text mean today? Which is more of an application question. So we have a research part and an application part. So I go into a lot of detail as to what each part consists of. So, what are good sources for question one? What are not good sources for question one? Um, and in answering two, the second part of the paper, um, I think the easiest way to think about this is think about a particular and perhaps hypothetical audience or even yourself, um, and think about what this text that you've chosen means to the audience that you've picked. In other words, to your Bible study, to your congregation, to residents of a nursing home, to, I don't know, people in crisis. Some sort of general category, I think, helps focus what it is that people say when answering question two. But there's some leeway there. So there's two parts to the paper, and there's kind of a sliding scale as to how much of your paper is research versus how much of your paper is application. So some people are in seminary um, with more academic goals than ministry goals. So I try to allow people that want to pursue that side of the course to be able to do that. Not that either of these are mutually exclusive things. And for people that are more interested in ministry and application, you can devote a large chunk of your paper, that is 80% of your paper, to thinking about application. So I hope that's clear, or at least gives you a general idea of where I'm going for on this paper. One thing that some students have asked to do in the past, and I think has worked out quite well, is for their application piece, they would like to preach on their text, on their assigned text. And I am totally cool with that. As a matter of fact, if you're perhaps doing a preaching class or having recently done a preaching class, this might be very good practice for you. And it's a different way of thinking about how would I apply this text and in a very concrete and real way. So if you pick that option, what I would like for you to do is to video your sermon, and you need to prepare a video that's at least 8 minutes in length, and you have to submit that along with your paper. And then by doing that, you reduce the overall minimum of your written work to 2,200 words. So if you go with that option, then it does reduce your paper option. So I don't know if that appeals to anybody in this class, but it might. So I wanted to make you aware that that was something that is available to you. Also, you can submit drafts of your paper in any form, just outlines, first pages, final drafts. The only thing that I ask is you give me some time to look at them before they're due. So sending me a draft the night before the paper is due is probably won't work. It might work, but it probably won't work. I have had students submit first pages before, which pretty quickly gives me an idea of whether or not students are on the right track. And occasionally I have had students that are completely on the wrong track. And by sending the first page, I realize and they realize subsequently that this isn't what I'm wanting at all. So sometimes that's a good, I don't know, safety net or alarm bell that you can set off just to make sure that there aren't big surprises at the end of the course. So some things about guidelines, which are kind of usual, but I am expecting these papers to follow what I'm calling standard academic structure. In other words, you have, just like you learned in college composition, you have an introduction with a thesis, you have supporting paragraphs that support your thesis, and then some sort of conclusion. If you want to intertwine your research with your ministry application, that's perfectly fine. If you want to do those in two sections of the paper, that's fine as well. I think I would be less, I don't know, strict about structure in the application part, but that doesn't mean that it can just be sort of notes gathered together on the page, which sometimes I get. Don't be late on your paper, but if you are running out of time and see that you will need additional time, contact me before the paper is due, not after the paper is due, and you'll find that I can be pretty accommodating in that regard. But when you do that, we'll agree on a new deadline, but then after that, no double extensions. So when the deadline approaches and you realize you're not going to get done, then you need to assess what's on your plate and give me a new reasonable deadline. So you're going to set that and not me unless it's completely unreasonable. Probably the most important part of the rubric here is going through the common paper downfalls. So these have been accumulated over reading hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of student papers over a long period of time. And it's kind of an accumulated list of what most often goes wrong on a biblical exegesis paper. So number one is that, I'll get a paper that's just kind of a collection of notes. Like I did research and here's what I found. So that's not at all what I'm looking for. So if you have, I don't know, a paper that's not categorized by your thesis and supporting paragraphs, something is immediately amiss. I talk about having a good thesis. So Samson is a story about a brave man who killed a lion. It's a thesis, but it's not something that you'll find much disagreement about. So to make an interesting thesis, you need to make an assertion that your reader might say, that's an interesting viewpoint. I really had never thought about that. Please tell me more. So that's the kind of thesis that I'm looking at. Also, you need to read the Bible very closely and carefully. And what happens sometimes is that people think things are in the Bible that aren't actually there. And usually my parade example is the mention of Cain and Abel, the story of Cain and Abel, and Cain kills Abel and he's has to leave his family and go wander. And then suddenly Cain is married and has a wife that has not been mentioned before in the text. So people have for centuries, probably since the first century at least, have speculated, most people, that this wife was Cain's sister. So it's fine to make that speculation. It's probably arguably a reasonable conclusion. But it's also important to note that the Bible does not say that. So that is your filling in a gap in the Bible, not something that is actually in the Bible. And some people have a really easy time of this. Some other people have a terrible time with this because they think of things or they think things are in the Bible that aren't actually there. Again, it's fine to include this kind of material, but you, the writer, need to show me that, my speculation is that X and Y happened, even though that's not what's in the text. And that's part of the assignment, is to get you thinking about the text that you're writing on. But don't say, the Bible says, if the Bible doesn't say. So that's one place where people seem to go astray. Number 4 is what I generally call not sufficiently engaging the text. And usually that just means you're talking about the story in the abstract, but you're not pointing to any specific details in the story that support what you're trying to say. So my little rule of thumb here is, if you finish your paper and you only have one or a few Bible references, you're probably not looking at the text closely enough. So you need to engage the text more. Number 5 is a biggie in seminaries, particularly. So a lot of people want to structure their paper going down the text verse by verse. And this format does not work well, typically, with the idea of having a thesis and supporting paragraphs. As a matter of fact, usually, or I would say virtually always, when students choose this structure, they end up saying, well, in chapter 25, verse 1, it says this, and then they'll give a quote. And the bulk of their paper ends up being a rehash of what the story is in the Bible. So they're retelling me the story, kind of going verse by verse. And it's not really engagement, it's not interpretation, it's not what I'm interested in, because I'm interested in your ideas. I already know the text, or if I am foggy on some details, I can easily look that up. So I want you to spend your time telling me what you think, not what's in the Bible. So that's kind of a fine line. Here's some things about paragraphs. And then finally, even though I warn people about using things from the internet in the first section of the paper, invariably there's at least 1 or 2 students that quotes a blog or some other source from the internet that just isn't appropriate for answering question 1. Now, such things may be great resources for answering question 2. So I'm not saying you can't use those things, but it's very important to keep in mind how those things should be used. So that's a quick rundown of the final paper prompt. If you have any questions before you're fully submitting to this class, please be sure and let me know, and hopefully we can work those out. Thanks so much for listening. Please read through the prompt. Again, every class I think I've ever taught, there's maybe 1 student that just didn't get around to reading the prompt for the final paper, and it didn't go well. So please read this. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Talk to you soon.